She's been sitting there since 8 this morning. The comment drifted across the executive lobby, just as the glass doors slid open and Graham Holloway stepped inside. The CEO barely slowed his stride. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor while assistants hurried behind him carrying tablets, schedules, and steaming cups of coffee. He glanced toward the waiting area for less than a second. A black woman sat quietly beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a leather portfolio resting on her lap. "Still here?" Graham asked. The receptionist nodded. "Yes, sir. She says she has an appointment." Graham checked his watch. "Then someone will get to her when they get to her." Without another word, he disappeared toward the private elevators. Around the lobby, conversations resumed. Phones rang. Security guards changed shifts. Executives crossed the gleaming floor in tailored suits worth more than some people's monthly rent. Yet the woman never moved. Hour after hour, Nia Whitaker remained in the same chair, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. By noon, the sunlight pouring through the windows painted long golden rectangles across the marble. By 2 o'clock, employees had started whispering. Some assumed she was a job applicant. Others guessed she was a vendor hoping for a contract. One young assistant even offered her a bottle of water out of sympathy. Nia accepted it with a grateful smile and returned to the notebook resting in her hands. Nobody asked who she really was. Nobody wondered why she seemed so unconcerned about the passing hours. And nobody noticed the small silver USB drive tucked inside her portfolio. If they had, they might have realized it carried information capable of changing the future of Holloway Industries. 5 hours passed. 5 hours of silence. 5 hours of being overlooked. Every so often, Graham emerged from another meeting surrounded by investors, attorneys, or board members. Each time he walked past the waiting area without learning the woman's name. Each time, Nia watched him go with the same quiet patience. The strange thing was that she never appeared angry. If anything, she seemed to be studying the building itself. The rushed employees, the nervous managers, the strained smiles that vanished the moment executives turned away. Somewhere around 3:30, she closed her notebook and looked out over the city skyline. Thousands of people moved below like tiny pieces on a giant chessboard. A faint reflection stared back at her from the glass. Calm, focused, certain. The certainty was what nobody understood. Because while everyone in that building believed they were watching a woman waiting for an opportunity, the truth was far more surprising. Nia Whitaker wasn't waiting for Holloway Industries to decide whether she mattered. She was deciding whether Holloway Industries deserved what she had brought with her. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. What happened next would cost someone far more than a missed appointment. It would cost them an opportunity worth $800 million. And by the time Graham Holloway finally learned the name of the woman sitting in his lobby, it would already be too late. At 4 o'clock, the executive lobby had taken on a different mood. The morning rush was gone. The polished marble floors reflected the softer light of the afternoon sun, and the conversations drifting through the building seemed quieter somehow. Nia Whitaker remained in her chair near the windows. To most people passing by, she had become part of the furniture, another unnoticed detail in a building filled with expensive details. A maintenance worker pushing a cart offered her a polite nod. She smiled and nodded back. Moments later, 2 junior analysts hurried past carrying presentation folders. One glanced toward her. "She is still here," he whispered. His colleague shrugged. Must be waiting for someone important. Neither realized how close he was to the truth. Nia lowered her eyes to the notebook resting on her lap. Several pages were filled with observations written in neat handwriting. Not financial projections. Not contract terms. Simple observations. How employees spoke to reception staff. How managers treated assistants. How often people smiled when they thought executives were watching. The longer she sat there, the more she learned. Across the country, people often believed company culture was built in conference rooms. Nia knew better. Real culture revealed itself in hallways, elevators, cafeterias, and waiting rooms. Especially waiting rooms. 3 years earlier, she had started Whitaker Transit Solutions with a single warehouse outside Cleveland. At the time, she owned one delivery route and a second-hand truck that struggled to start during winter mornings. Banks had rejected her. Investors had ignored her. More than once, people had assumed she was an assistant rather than the founder. Yet she had kept going. One contract became 10. 10 became 50. Then came the software platform. Then the regional partnerships. Then the acquisitions. By the time industry magazines started noticing her company, she had already built something competitors could not easily copy. Reliability, trust, relationships. The qualities that never appeared on quarterly reports until they were gone. A faint vibration interrupted her thoughts. Her phone screen lit up with a message from her chief operating officer. Board meeting starts in 45 minutes. Any update? Nia stared at the screen for a moment before typing a short reply. Learning more than expected. Seconds later, a response appeared. Good or bad? Nia looked across the lobby. Near the elevators, a senior executive was speaking sharply to a young assistant who appeared barely out of college. The young woman apologized repeatedly while clutching a tablet against her chest. The executive walked away without acknowledging her. Nia returned her attention to the phone. Bad. She slipped the device back into her portfolio. Outside the windows, clouds drifted across the skyline. Inside, the giant digital clock above reception displayed 4:17 p.m. Less than an hour remained before the board would gather upstairs. Less than an hour before Graham Holloway expected to finalize what he believed was the most important partnership of the year. Yet at that very moment, he still had no idea that the person holding the final decision had spent the entire day sitting less than 50 feet from his office. And with every passing minute, the answer she planned to give him was changing. Up on the 32nd floor, Graham Holloway was having the kind of day he enjoyed most. Every conference room he entered seemed to shift around him. Executives straightened in their chairs. Department heads adjusted presentations. Investors listened carefully when he spoke. For nearly 20 years, he had built a reputation as a man who rarely lost negotiations and never tolerated wasted time. His office reflected the same philosophy. Dark walnut panels lined the walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago. Framed business awards stretched across an entire section of shelving. Everything was organized, polished, controlled. Exactly the way Graham liked it. He stood beside a digital display reviewing final projections with his executive team. Numbers filled the screen in bright columns. Revenue forecasts. Expansion models. Market share estimates. The figures looked impressive even by Holloway Industries standards. Once the partnership is finalized, we gain immediate access to 3 new regional networks, said Martin Pierce, the chief financial officer. Graham nodded without looking away from the screen. And the competition? Martin adjusted his glasses. They will struggle to keep up. A faint smile appeared on Graham's face. He enjoyed hearing that. Across the table, another executive flipped through several documents. There is still no confirmation from Whitaker Transit Solutions. Graham dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. They will be here. The room fell quiet. Nobody challenged him. Nobody reminded him that no agreement had actually been signed. Over the years, people had learned that Graham expected confidence from others but certainty from himself. The distinction mattered. Outside the conference room, assistants moved quickly through hallways carrying reports and updated schedules. One young coordinator approached Graham's executive assistant near the elevators. Should we follow up with Ms. Whitaker? She asked. The assistant glanced at her watch. The board meeting starts soon. If she has not checked in by now, someone from her team probably will. Neither woman knew that Nia Whitaker had checked in nearly 6 hours earlier. Meanwhile, Graham continued moving from meeting to meeting. He reviewed presentations, approved recommendations, and answered calls from investors in New York and Dallas. At one point, he passed through the executive lobby again. His attention remained fixed on messages appearing across his phone screen. For a brief moment, he walked directly past the waiting area. Nia looked up as he crossed the marble floor. Graham never looked back. The distance between them could not have been more than 20 feet. Yet it might as well have been 20 miles. Near 5 o'clock, the atmosphere inside Holloway Industries began to change. Employees moved with greater urgency. Board members arrived through private entrances. Catering staff prepared refreshments outside the main conference room. The partnership announcement was expected to be the highlight of the quarter. Investors were waiting. Analysts were waiting. Reporters were waiting. And somewhere inside the building, people assumed Nia Whitaker was waiting too. But they were wrong. For the first time all day, Nia closed her notebook completely. Her eyes drifted toward the elevators one last time. The decision she had spent hours considering was no longer difficult. Sometimes a company revealed its character through billion-dollar strategies. Sometimes it revealed its character through a single chair in a waiting room. And Holloway Industries had revealed far more than Graham Holloway realized. At 4:57 p.m., the giant clock above reception clicked forward by a single minute. The sound was almost impossible to hear beneath the steady hum of the lobby, yet Nia Whitaker noticed it immediately. She looked at the time, then slowly closed her portfolio. Around her, employees continued moving through the building without paying much attention. A courier signed paperwork near the front desk. 2 attorneys stepped out of an elevator discussing compliance regulations. A security officer exchanged greetings with the departing employee. To everyone else, it was an ordinary Friday afternoon. To Nia, it was the end of an experiment. She rose from her chair for the first time in nearly 7 hours. The receptionist looked up with visible surprise. "Leaving already?" she asked politely before realizing how strange the question sounded. Nia smiled gently. "I think I have seen everything I needed to see." The receptionist blinked. "Would you like me to check on your appointment one more time?" For a brief moment, Nia considered the offer. She glanced toward the elevators where executives continued disappearing behind polished steel doors. Then she shook her head. "No, that will not be necessary." She reached into her portfolio and removed a large sealed envelope. Her name was written neatly across the front in black ink. Beneath it was a second name, Graham Holloway. "Please make sure this reaches him before his board meeting begins." The receptionist accepted the envelope carefully. Something about Nia's calm confidence made the request feel unusually important. "Of course." Nia nodded. "Thank you." Then she turned and walked toward the exit. No dramatic farewell. No frustration. No raised voice. Just quiet certainty. Outside, the evening air felt cooler than it had that morning. The glass tower behind her reflected streaks of orange sunlight from the western sky. Cars moved through downtown traffic below. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed between buildings. Nia paused at the corner and looked back one final time. For months, she had believed this partnership could become one of the most important projects of her career. $800 million in shared logistics infrastructure. Thousands of jobs. New transportation routes across multiple states. The opportunity had been enormous. But opportunities worked both ways. Partnerships required trust, respect, character. And those qualities could not be measured on spreadsheets. Her phone vibrated. This time it was a message from her legal counsel. Final decision? Nia stared at the screen for a moment before typing 4 simple words. Proceed with alternate agreement. The response came almost instantly. Understood. Nia slipped the phone back into her coat pocket and continued walking toward the waiting black sedan parked across the street. As the driver opened the rear door, she settled into the seat and looked out the window. The city moved around her in a blur of lights and reflections. Behind her, high above the streets, board members were beginning to gather around a polished conference table. Presentations were ready. Financial forecasts were prepared. Expectations were high. Nobody in that room knew that the decision they believed was still pending had already been made. Back inside the lobby, the receptionist glanced at the envelope resting beside her keyboard. A strange feeling settled in her chest. She could not explain why, but she suddenly sensed that whatever was inside might change the entire evening. Upstairs, Graham Holloway straightened his tie and entered the boardroom with complete confidence. He believed the biggest success of the year was only minutes away. He had no idea that it was already walking out the front door. The boardroom doors closed at exactly 5:15 p.m. A wall of windows overlooked the city as evening settled across the skyline. Around the polished table sat 12 board members, 3 senior executives, 2 legal advisors, and Graham Holloway at the head of it all. Confidence filled the room. Laptops glowed. Presentation slides waited on giant screens. Coffee cups rested beside stacks of reports. Months of preparation had led to this meeting. Graham leaned back comfortably. "Let us begin." Martin Pierce stood and adjusted his tie. Before we finalize projections, we should confirm arrival status from Whitaker Transit Solutions. Several heads nodded. Graham checked his watch. They are probably running late. No one seemed particularly concerned. For months, every discussion had pointed toward a successful partnership. The numbers made sense. The expansion strategy made sense. Everything made sense. Then one board member frowned. Has anyone actually spoken with Nia Whitaker today? The question lingered in the room. Martin looked toward the legal team. The legal team looked toward operations. Operations looked toward the executive assistant seated near the wall. A subtle uncertainty began spreading through the room. The assistant opened her tablet. I can check. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. Seconds passed. Then her expression changed. Actually, she stopped typing. What is it? Graham asked. The assistant swallowed. According to reception records, Ms. Whitaker checked in this morning. Silence. This morning. Graham repeated. At what time? 8:11. The room seemed to lose its momentum all at once. Several board members exchanged confused glances. Martin leaned forward. She was here. Yes. The assistant continued reading. She remained in the executive lobby throughout the day. Graham sat upright. Why was I not informed? No one answered immediately. The assistant hesitated. Sir, multiple messages were sent regarding an unidentified visitor waiting for an appointment. Graham's jaw tightened slightly. The words sounded familiar now. A woman sitting near the windows. A woman he had passed several times without a second thought. Before he could respond, the boardroom doors opened. His executive assistant stepped inside carrying a large envelope. This was left for you. The room grew quiet again. Graham accepted the envelope and noticed his name written neatly across the front. Something cold settled in his stomach. For the first time all day, certainty abandoned him. He opened the seal carefully. Inside were several documents and a single letter. The first line immediately drained the color from his face. Martin noticed it first. Graham. No response. Graham continued reading. Every page seemed heavier than the one before it. Across the table, board members shifted uneasily. Finally Martin spoke again. What happened? Graham lowered the letter slowly. The room waited. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Then he looked up. She withdrew. The words landed like a stone in still water. Confusion spread instantly. Withdrew from what? One director asked. Graham stared at the final page. Everything. Martin reached for the documents. His eyes widened as he scanned the details. The alternate agreement had already been executed. Signatures completed. Legal approvals finalized. Funding secured. Whitaker Transit Solutions had committed to another partner, less than 30 minutes earlier. The opportunity they had spent months pursuing no longer existed. The room erupted into stunned questions. Graham heard almost none of them. His attention remained fixed on one handwritten sentence near the bottom of the letter. It was simple. Respect is never revealed during a negotiation. It is revealed long before one begins. For the first time that day, Graham Holloway realized exactly who had been sitting in his lobby, and exactly what his arrogance had just cost him. For several seconds after the questions began, Graham Holloway remained completely still. The boardroom that had been filled with confidence only minutes earlier now felt strangely distant. Voices blurred together. Someone was asking about legal options. Another director was demanding an explanation. Martin Pierce was already reviewing the alternate agreement line by line. None of it seemed real. Graham's eyes remained fixed on the letter in front of him. Outside the windows, the last light of day painted the city in shades of amber and blue. Far below, headlights streamed through downtown streets like rivers of light. The world continued moving. Inside the boardroom, everything had stopped. Can we challenge this? One board member asked. Martin shook his head slowly. No. The agreement is fully executed. Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Final. Graham stood without saying a word. The leather chair slid backward across the carpet. Several people looked toward him, expecting instructions. Instead, he simply walked out. The hallway beyond the boardroom felt unusually quiet. Most employees had already gone home. The energy that normally filled the executive floor had faded into scattered footsteps and distant elevator chimes. Graham loosened his tie as he moved toward the windows overlooking the city. For the first time all day, he was alone. He stood there for a long moment. The glass reflected his image against the darkening skyline. A successful CEO. A respected industry leader. A man who had built an empire from almost nothing. Yet the reflection staring back at him seemed unfamiliar somehow. He thought about the woman in the lobby. The woman he had passed again and again. He remembered the chair by the windows. The leather portfolio resting on her lap. The calm expression that never changed. Most of all, he remembered never asking her name. Not once. A quiet realization settled over him. Nia Whitaker had not judged Holloway Industries based on a presentation. She had judged it based on people. Based on behavior. Based on the countless small moments most executives never noticed. Graham suddenly understood why the letter hurt more than losing the deal itself. Money could be replaced. Contracts could be replaced. Opportunities could be replaced. Character was different. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from an investor appeared on the screen. Heard about the partnership. What happened? Graham stared at the words but did not respond. Another message followed. Then another. Questions were already spreading through the business community. The news would travel quickly. He slipped the phone away and looked back toward the empty hallway. Somewhere downstairs, the lobby lights would still be glowing. The same reception desk. The same waiting area. The same chair where Nia had spent nearly 7 hours observing everything. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Years earlier, when Graham had first started his company, he had spent an entire afternoon waiting outside an executive office in Detroit. The executive never came out. Never offered a meeting. Never acknowledged his presence. Graham remembered driving home furious, promising himself he would never treat people that way if he ever became successful. The memory hit harder than any financial report. He closed his eyes briefly. Success had changed many things over the years. Somewhere along the way it had changed him too. Beyond the glass, evening settled fully across Chicago. The lights of the city shimmered beneath a darkening sky. Graham remained standing in silence, watching his reflection fade into the window. For the first time in a very long time, he was not thinking about profits, growth, or competition. He was thinking about a woman who had waited patiently all day, said almost nothing, and somehow revealed more about his company than any consultant ever had. The next morning, Graham arrived at the office before sunrise. The city was still wrapped in pale blue shadows when he stepped into the executive lobby. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about meetings or quarterly reports. His eyes drifted immediately toward the waiting area beside the windows. The chair was empty now. Housekeeping had already straightened the cushions. The water bottle Nia had accepted the day before was gone. Nothing remained except silence. Yet somehow the space felt different. Graham stood there longer than he intended. "Good morning, sir," the receptionist said cautiously. He turned toward her. "Yesterday, when Ms. Whitaker was here, did she say much?" The receptionist seemed surprised by the question. She thought for a moment. "Not really. She was very polite. She thanked everyone. She spent most of the day observing." Graham nodded slowly. Observing. The word echoed in his mind. That was exactly what she had been doing. Not waiting. Observing. Measuring. Deciding. Upstairs, the fallout had already begun. Overnight emails filled his inbox. Investors wanted answers. Analysts wanted explanations. Industry reporters were asking why one of the largest logistics partnerships in recent memory had collapsed without warning. The official statement blamed strategic differences. Graham knew better. Strategic differences had not destroyed the deal. Character had. Around 9 o'clock, Martin Pierce entered Graham's office carrying a thick folder. "You should see this." Graham accepted it. Inside were profiles, interviews, business publications, and industry reports focused entirely on Whitaker Transit Solutions. He flipped through the pages in silence. Warehouse expansions. Technology breakthroughs. National Logistics Awards. Community investment programs. Employee retention records that ranked among the highest in the industry. Every page seemed to reveal another achievement. Graham stopped at a photograph taken 6 months earlier. Nia stood inside a distribution center speaking with employees. No stage. No spotlight. No executive distance. Just conversation. The workers around her looked relaxed, comfortable, respected. She built all this? Graham asked quietly. Martin nodded. Almost entirely from scratch. Another page revealed that several Fortune 500 companies had attempted partnerships with her organization during the past 2 years. Most had been declined. Graham stared at the numbers. Revenue growth. Expansion metrics. Infrastructure assets. The scale was astonishing. Yet one detail stood out more than any financial figure. Employee satisfaction. 96%. He leaned back slowly. How did I not know any of this? Martin hesitated. Then he answered honestly. Because nobody looked. The room fell silent. The answer hurt because it was true. Graham had spent months discussing contracts and projections without ever learning who was sitting across the table. Worse, he had spent an entire day proving exactly why she should not trust him. His phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. Harold Bennett, Chief Executive Officer of Pinnacle Freight, the competitor that had secured the agreement. Graham answered. Congratulations, Harold said. There was no arrogance in his voice. No mockery. Somehow that made it worse. Thank you, Graham replied. You met with her? Harold chuckled softly. 3 times. Graham closed his eyes briefly. And? There was a short pause. She wanted to know how we treat people. The words landed harder than any business loss. After the call ended, Graham remained seated in silence. Outside his office windows, employees filled the hallways as another workday began. Phones rang. Elevators opened and closed. Meetings started. Yet one thought refused to leave him. Nia Whitaker had not chosen a company. She had chosen a culture. And for the first time in his career, Graham understood that the most expensive mistake he had ever made had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with the person he had failed to see. 3 days later, Graham Holloway stepped out of a black sedan in Cleveland, Ohio. The autumn air carried the scent of rain-soaked pavement and freshly cut grass from a nearby park. Across the street stood the headquarters of Whitaker Transit Solutions. It was not a towering skyscraper covered in marble and glass. It was a modern 6-story building with wide windows, brick accents, and employees moving in and out through the front entrance carrying coffee cups and laptops. The place felt alive. Graham paused before crossing the street. For perhaps the first time in decades, he was walking into a meeting without leverage, without advantage, and without certainty. Inside, the reception area was bright and welcoming. Natural sunlight poured through large windows. Employees greeted one another by name. Nobody appeared rushed or intimidated. Graham noticed it immediately. The atmosphere felt completely different from his own headquarters. A receptionist smiled. Good morning. How may I help you? Graham introduced himself. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, but there was no judgment in her expression. Ms. Whitaker has a full schedule today. Graham nodded. I understand. I am not here to discuss the partnership. The receptionist looked curious. Then what are you here for? Graham took a slow breath. To apologize. 30 minutes later, he found himself seated in a conference room overlooking a freight yard where trucks moved in careful patterns beneath a cloudy sky. The room was simple. No oversized displays. No expensive artwork. Just a polished wooden table and a wall covered with photographs of employees from different locations across the country. The door opened quietly. Nia Whitaker stepped inside carrying a tablet. She looked exactly as she had 3 days earlier. Calm. Composed. Certain. Graham stood immediately. For a moment neither spoke. Then Nia offered a polite smile and took a seat across from him. What can I do for you, Mr. Holloway? Graham remained standing for another second before sitting down. He had rehearsed dozens of explanations during the drive from Chicago. None of them seemed useful now. I owe you an apology. Nia studied him quietly. The freight yard outside hummed with distant activity. For the deal? She asked. Graham shook his head. No. The answer surprised even him. For the way I treated you before there was ever a deal. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. Graham looked down briefly before continuing. I spent years telling myself I respected people. Then you spent one day in my building and showed me that I was wrong. Nia listened without interruption. Her expression remained neutral but not cold. Graham continued. You were there for hours. I walked past you more than once. I never asked your name. I never asked why you were there. I saw what I expected to see instead of what was actually in front of me. The words felt heavier once spoken aloud. Nia folded her hands on the table. Do you know what surprised me most that day? Graham looked up. She smiled faintly. It was not that you ignored me. He frowned slightly. It was not. No. She glanced toward the photographs covering the wall. It was how many other people believed that was normal. Graham had no response. As she was right. The realization settled between them. Then Nia leaned back slightly. People often think respect is demonstrated during important moments. Big meetings. Major contracts. Public speeches. She shook her head gently. Real respect appears when there is nothing to gain. Graham sat silently as her words echoed through the room. For the first time since the partnership collapsed, he felt something unexpected. Not defeat. Not embarrassment. Gratitude. Because she was giving him something far more valuable than a second chance at a contract. She was giving him a chance to become better than the man who had let her sit in that lobby unnoticed. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. When it ended, neither of them mentioned contracts, revenue projections, or lost opportunities. They spoke about leadership, about culture, about the responsibility that came with influence. As Graham finally stood to leave, Nia walked him toward the lobby. Employees passed them along the way, offering greetings and brief smiles. Some stopped to ask Nia questions. Others simply wished her a good afternoon. She knew their names. They knew hers. The respect between them felt natural, effortless, earned. At the entrance, Graham paused beside the glass doors. Outside, light rain had begun to fall across the parking lot, turning the pavement into a mirror of gray skies and reflected headlights. For a moment, neither person spoke. Then Graham extended his hand. Thank you for seeing me. Nia shook it warmly. Thank you for coming. He nodded once. There was nothing left to explain. Nothing left to defend. For the first time in many years, he walked away from a business meeting feeling lighter than when he entered. The drive back to Chicago gave him several hours alone with his thoughts. Mile after mile of highway stretched beneath darkening skies. The city eventually appeared on the horizon, glowing against the evening clouds. Yet his mind kept returning to a simple realization. Success had taught him how to build companies. Failure had just taught him how to build character. The following Monday, employees arriving at Holloway Industries noticed something unusual. Graham was already standing in the lobby, not passing through, standing there, greeting people as they entered the building. Reception staff looked confused. Security officers exchanged surprised glances. Some employees thought it was connected to an upcoming announcement. Others assumed cameras must be hidden somewhere. But there were no cameras, no reporters, no publicity campaign. Just Graham, listening, watching, learning. Over the weeks that followed, changes began appearing throughout the company. Executive training programs expanded. Employee feedback systems were redesigned. Waiting areas were improved. New mentorship initiatives connected senior leaders with entry-level staff. Some executives resisted the changes at first. Others questioned the need. Graham listened patiently. Then he told them a story. Not about an $800 million partnership. Not about financial losses. He spoke about a person sitting quietly in a chair while an entire organization revealed who they really were. Months later, industry publications noticed something unexpected. Employee retention improved. Internal satisfaction scores climbed. Productivity increased. The numbers attracted attention, but Graham knew the numbers were only the result. The real change had happened much earlier. It had begun the moment he stopped measuring people by titles and started seeing them as individuals. Across the country, Whitaker Transit Solutions continued growing. New facilities opened. New partnerships flourished. Nia remained focused on the work she loved, rarely speaking publicly about what had happened in Chicago. She never needed revenge. She never needed recognition. The lesson had already done its work. One evening nearly a year later, Graham stood alone in the same executive lobby where everything had started. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows. Employees headed home after another successful day. The chair beside the glass remained there unchanged. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he smiled quietly. Not because of what he had lost, because of what he had learned. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the building felt warmer somehow. The lobby lights reflected across the polished marble floor. Conversations faded. Elevators hummed in the distance. And in the gentle silence of an ordinary evening, there was no contract to sign, no deal to save, and no speech left to give. Only the quiet understanding that respect costs nothing, yet its absence can cost everything.